Hi, and welcome to the final episode of Differential Diagnosis Season 1, the podcast where we discuss everything there is about House MD. Well, we've just come to the end of our run of reviewing and analysing and discussing every single episode of House MD Season 1, and now that we've done all the main episodes, we thought we'd do one final sort of summation that we could probably do at the end of each season, just to sort of largely talk about what we thought about the season, where it went right, where it went wrong. And this is probably most integral given that it's the first season, it's starting off the whole show, and there's a lot to talk about because it's establishing pretty much everything. My name's Harvey, and welcome from me. And as always, here's your other co-host, Gaz.
Welcome from me. Celebrate good times, come on. We've done it. Differential diagnosis. I don't know, I just try. I try these things. But yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here. We've had a really great time doing this, I guess. It was just a noble experiment to see if we could at least get through season 1 with the ambition of doing 7 more seasons. And it's been a complete goddamn success.
As I like talking about the podcast itself, I've also really enjoyed this. It's been great. I can't wait to do season 2. I'm most impressed that we found stuff to talk about each episode.
Yeah.
Because even though grandly, like largely when we were talking about doing it in the first place, we were like talking about what we thought about the series, and we were like, yeah, we think this, and then we were like, oh, there seems like enough here to actually talk about consistently. But then because there's also, the house formula is pretty set in stone, we were worried like, oh, is there going to be enough to talk about each episode? And I'm quite impressed that we've managed to take like the 5 initial thoughts we had about why it would be interesting, and then we can talk pretty significantly about each episode rather than just summing up the plot and just going, this happened, this happened, this happened. I like it is good. I do not like it bad. Yeah, I thought that was mildly surprising, but a good surprise. So hopefully everyone listening has found the discussions as interesting as we have.
Yeah.
But you never know. But at the very least, the quality might not be high, but the content is there.
Well, yeah, you might also be watching this out of some perverse need to make yourself angry, uncomfortable, or just generally dissatisfied with life. I mean, that's always an aim.
Absolutely.
I'll accept
and you've
that.
easily gotten 24 hours of that. You've gotten a whole day of that.
Yeah, and also we're willing to provide that, regardless of what your intentions are. If you hate this and it gives you something to kind of get off on, feel free. But if you actually legitimately enjoy this show, then even better. I'd also like to do a shout out to all the people that have gotten in touch with us about the podcast. It's encouraging when people listen to us. It's encouraging when people give us feedback. It's really it gives us a bit of drive also to do new things, because we look for your suggestions in making the show work, especially like DD Extra. If it wasn't for input, it probably wouldn't have happened, and then we wouldn't have done the fan fiction episode. So yeah, I mean, just a general thank you to the audience as well. You've stayed with us. You've got over a day's worth of content from us. And you've tolerated us, so thank you for tolerating us.
Yeah, completely. I agree. It is, it's nice to be able to do things and then for people to say whether or not they liked it, which is good. I don't mind if people don't like it, but it's hard to know what people want. So yeah, we've asked people what they wanted to see. They've said it. We've had good suggestions from listeners like @HateCrimesMD, which I think is a pretty funny Twitter handle. Who suggested the fanfic episode. So that kind of stuff's really cool. And it's hopefully as we get a bit more like consistent and we sort of experiment with it more, there might be loads more episode ideas that come from it. So we'll see. But anyway, we've self-indulged a lot there. But thank you very much for listening, anyone. That's really fundamentally what we were going to say.
Yeah. So should we crack on with looking at season 1 from 30,000 feet, as they say, giving the bird's eye view? You know, using all that corporate jargon crap.
Absolutely. I think with this episode, like, this is more of just like a chat to sum it up. So, you'll probably hear a lot of, if you've listened to the whole thing, you'll probably hear a lot of the same opinions again, because we're trying to be consistent in what we think. So we'll probably say the same thing again. But hey, if you just want to hang out and listen to an overview of season 1, then this is it. This is probably the only one there is. So enjoy it. But yeah, I guess we should just to round off season 1, let's get cracking and discuss House MD season 1 season summary. So it all started as a medical procedural with a strong central character who was a maverick. He was a little bit kooky. He was a little bit grouchy. He was a doctor who didn't like the humanity of medicine. And from that initial standpoint and a very orange pilot, it went on to be one of the best realized characters in television at that time and since, I think. So I guess the best starting point is to sort of generally chat about how the show began and how it went from what could have been any old medical procedural, just another one, to at points a pretty compelling character drama in the guise of a medical procedural. Would you agree with that as a kind of journey, Gaz? Because I know we've talked sometimes that it feels like they wanted to have a certain drama which looked at some more depressing themes, and it was sort of slipped under the radar as just a kind of interesting medical procedural to the network.
Yeah. There was certainly some sort of bright-eyed and bushy-tailed veneer given to the pilot that allowed for there to be space for something that would look more closely at the very idea of a man who, I guess you could say, although many are loath to admit, the Sherlock Holmes of medicine of a kind, but then a deeply flawed character with a sense of cynicism, anarchy, and a degree of sardonic humour involved.
Yeah, not something you see in a protagonist very often.
No, you don't. And someone who doesn't buy into the kind of, as you say, the humanity of medicine, at least initially. And also, he has throughout the season, he has a very strained relationship between his own humanity, the humanity of the patients, the humanity of his team, and the disease that he treats in every episode. And I think that's something to kind of reflect on. It's not like, oh, we've made him out to be inhumane in pilot, and then we just switched it all around and played with the formula and made it inconsistent. The whole premise is that he has a difficult relationship with everybody else, the entirety of the human race in a way, but he feels compelled to heal them. But anyway, getting back to what you were saying, the earlier episodes, I think all the way up to Detox, carves out a space for this character to be introduced, to look at his idiosyncrasies and his abilities, so that we can explore his character more thoroughly later on. It's like a kind of incubation period for the disease of House.
Yeah. Well, the Sherlock Holmes comparison is, I mean, that's really well known, that there's a lot of sort of, at least like taking the skeleton of Sherlock Holmes. Clearly, David Shaw is a fan of that. He's a fan of that kind of character archetype. And there aren't a lot of characters like that. And it's a very interesting archetype to base it on anyway. It's a very, like, interesting person that, to a degree, some people might be like, oh, they're the person you want to be. If you don't think about all of, like, the bad elements of it, like being really lonely and slightly miserable. But this Sherlock Holmes one is like comparison is very interesting as well, because, as you say, up until Detox, it's more that the character's interesting, but they don't really seem. But all of the kind of negative aspects are very downplayed of that person. We kind of get a very surface level of him, which I think is very true of Sherlock Holmes. I think if you read Sherlock Holmes again, like, Sherlock Holmes is really obsessive about crimes, about solving puzzles, and, he does heroin in his spare time, but none of those elements are really dwelled on, like it's a problem. It's very surface value because it's made to be really entertaining. And so, you don't think like, oh, why is why is Sherlock Holmes doing heroin? Is there a deeper problem? It's done as like, he's really bored. He's doing heroin. When the crime comes, he gets right back on it and he forgets about his heroin problem. So it's,
yeah, like,
so it's one of those things where, you don't really see like the downsides of that. Whereas I think what makes House really clever is that they do exactly that for the first 11 episodes. It's very surface value. Like, I think a worse version of House would be, it would continue. House's problems with the Vicodin would never be brought up. It'd just be like, hey, he just takes too many painkillers. What a crazy self-destructive guy. And then you have these moments where it's like, oh, this is serious. And from that moment, about midway in the season, the show then really runs with that. And anybody who's watched the much later seasons knows that doesn't stop. And House at times stops being funny, not in the same way that Sherlock Holmes does. Sherlock Holmes never has that moment where it stops being funny or entertaining.
Yeah, and also I think the detachment that House has from society is different from the detachment that Sherlock Holmes does have with the society. Sherlock Holmes is aloof, doesn't really engage in the sense of what House does. He's confronted by people always come up against him with their very human traits and their ability to and their desire to confront him, I guess, in many cases. As you see that with Foreman, you see that with Cameron, you see that with Chase, different forms of confrontation. And he has to grapple with that. And then you see the kind of his attempt for a kind of separation, a gap between him as a person and the rest of the world come to light in that. It's very different because no one's going to Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes, I really don't trust your objectivity on this case, because even though you're a world-famous detective, you are an opium fiend, and we really worry about what you're doing, and we think you're going to endanger life. Maybe you're going to get a case wrong and have someone convicted who's incorrect, because you're a loose cannon, Sherlock. You're a loose cannon.
Yeah.
Because your powers are so... they're trusted so much that people will put their lives in your hands, or even justice in your hands, and you're going to misuse it, Sherlock. So maybe you shouldn't do this detective game until you get cold turkey. You don't get that in that. You don't get Watson going up to Sherlock Holmes and saying that, or having a bet with Watson. Yeah, I can, or to the what's the name of the detective that he kind of talks with,
I can't remember
Yeah.
offhand, but I think most people know who you're talking about because there's only like 4 characters in
Yeah,
Sherlock Holmes.
the detective isn't going, all right, Sherlock, I'll bet you can't, you know, get off the opium for a week. It just wouldn't be something that's interrogated. So if you look at it through that kind of thought experiment, you can see that there's a lot of depth to Gregory House in comparison to
Yeah,
Sherlock
completely.
Holmes, but the archetype is an interesting one in which to pose those questions to prosecute that case.
And as you say, it's the fact that Sherlock Holmes has more people around him questioning him,
Mm-hmm.
which is what kind of makes the show. Because even though it's called House MD, he's the main character. Um, I think the show would have lived or died based on the strength of its other cast. And what I think the show does really well is, it doesn't just have a bunch of people who are just, questioning House or just like critiquing him all the time. It's got like, by the end of the first season, I think some very fleshed out characters who, as you say, like they're criticizing him for different reasons. They all have different backgrounds, and everyone approaches it from a different direction. So each episode, I mean, House is criticized in each episode by about 5 people. There's Cuddy, uh, Chase, Cameron, Foreman, and Wilson. They're all criticizing him, but they criticize him and question him in different ways, or else it would just turn into 5 different occasions of House. Are you sure about this? Which wouldn't have been
Yeah.
interesting. And then not only their lives aren't just about questioning House, we then see the reasons why they do that, and we have their own stories where House criticizes
Mm.
them, because it's not just how House is like House is a bit different to Sherlock as well. Obviously, I don't want this to just turn into a big Sherlock comparison, but the reason why House is interesting and has a bit more emotional depth is very easy to talk about with Sherlock Holmes as an example, because Sherlock Holmes is like freelance. He doesn't really work with anyone. As you say, he's very aloof. Whereas House is like quite a famous doctor who's obviously working for a hospital. He's on the payroll.
Yeah.
Like he's not quite as disconnected as that. So it's like, you know, he's running a team. He socializes with people. You can't just have him being insane and people questioning it. Like House has to give other people advice. Those doctors are on a fellowship. He's also a teacher. And while he's a teacher that's questioned, he also has to teach people. So there's this nice mix of, House is giving them advice, and then they sort of question the philosophy of it. And then at times you see the characters inspired by the philosophy or fighting against the philosophy that he holds of how you should conduct medicine, that it should be reason and rationalism over everything, even at the cost of, politeness or, kindness.
Or even,
Think,
at the cost of harming someone.
oh yeah, completely.
I mean, that does come up in DNR, which is within that first early tranche of episodes, which is, my God, that's pretty extreme.
Yeah, well, DNR is one of those first moments. Detox is the big reveal of House having problems, but DNR is one of those nice moments where House meets a reflection of himself, and you start to see that maybe he's not very happy. Those earlier episodes don't have quite the gravitas that they do after Detox, but it's there. It's not like it comes out of nowhere, which is kind of the way that the show, I think, is drip feeding and getting under the nose of the producers a bit, because if you read interviews with David Shaw, like the original premise for the show wasn't to be as character based. It slowly became more character based, and you can kind of tell the philosophy took over when they named the show after the actual Doctor. And then on top of that, like, it's very interesting reading how the producers disagreed with the showrunners, because you have the Vogler thing, you have the fact that the producers didn't want Hugh Laurie because they didn't think he'd be sexy enough.
Yeah.
Like, it seems like a very long struggle to like get the show they wanted made. So it's incredible that they managed to pull it off, and that eventually, NBC or Universal, kind of had the confidence to really give, let them run with it, which is great. But,
I mean, it's worth mentioning, the history of casting House, right? Because you know a lot more about this than I do, right? with the famous casting video of Hugh Laurie.
Yeah, that's one of those like weirdly popular casting videos that came out where it's yeah, I think I think a lot of the team didn't even know he was English.
Yeah.
And I know that he was just coming off the filming of Flight of the Phoenix, and if you watch the start of the video, you can hear him complaining about how terrible the filming's going, which yeah, it's pretty incredible because Hugh Laurie is, Hugh Laurie was doing totally fine. It's not one of those like, oh, if Hugh Laurie hadn't got a house, it would have been a terrible thing. Aside from the show's quality, but yeah, Hugh Laurie was sort of in England was very well known for his sketch comedy in A Bit of Fry and Laurie, and then for a while, and Blackadder as well, and then for a while just sort of was just doing stuff. And I know he's doing a lot of stuff in America, but he was mostly like the dad in Stuart Little, and the angry British man in, in Flight of the Phoenix, or that man that Rachel gets in an argument with on the aeroplane in Friends. So yeah, House seems to have really been a big break, and it's amazing when you see those roles that make somebody's career. So I think that's probably why the casting behind it is so well known, because it's very weird for the person who was in Jeeves and Wooster to then become like, who was known for doing like quite silly comedic roles, to then go and do House.
Yeah, like in Blackadder, but I mean, he played an aloof, mainly in all of them that he was in. He was always playing this kind of aloof, posh person. So
yeah, he was always posh.
Blackadder the Third was, posh and aloof, foolish regent character, and then in Blackadder Goes Forth, another posh, aloof character who was completely like blindsided by the jingoism of World War One. I mean, these characters are complete fools. And it kind of lends into the character type that he played as Jeeves. No, not Jeeves. Bertie Wooster in Jeeves and Wooster TV adaptation, which I think is an amazing bit of television. But it seemed like he had been cast a type. And he was always intimately known as part of a comedy duo with Stephen Fry, and it's always interesting to reflect on how he then moves into this role where he's he's a serious actor in his own right.
He doesn't do comedy anymore, really, which is quite interesting. It's a total shift.
Yeah. But it's just very interesting to see that there is a lot... I don't have all the facts to hand, but that must have been a big shift for Hugh Laurie to go into this role and immerse himself in this role. Season 1 is his first, a first real shot at something as big as this and as kind of serious and cerebral as that. Such a giant project. And I think that was I just wanted to mention that because I think it's something we sometimes miss. Sometimes we always talk within the show, apart from little bits like, writers like David Foster or, the Vogler episodes where the kind of showrunners and the producers are at loggerheads.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to kind of say that, it's remarkable for us as British viewers to see who we would generally view as a comedic actor playing a very serious role like that. It's jarring to us anyway, as a kind of in a cultural sense. But he owns that role. I don't think you could think of Hugh Laurie and not think of House and that character. And a lot of Americans didn't even know he was not American. They thought he was American. They didn't think he was English, which is interesting as well. I mean, that just is testament to his ability to, his ability to adopt that accent and adopt that character. I mean, these are very kind of anodyne, basic points, but I just thought it would be useful just to put that into context of the season. That must have been quite a risk for him and I guess David Shaw as well.
Yeah. Which I do like that there's a lot of stories about the kind of background fights between, the studio producing it and the showrunners. And it's these kind of stories are prominent in lots of popular TV shows, and it's but those kind of stories fall away very quickly after season one. I think it shows how well season one did, and then the team were basically just told that they can pretty much do whatever they wanted by the looks of it, because House goes into some very dark places that a show like that certainly wouldn't have. And I can fully imagine that, while in the show pitch, that they were not pushing some of the ideas that turned up in season 6 and season 7 with House goes to rehab. Like, that's not like a cutesy little show idea.
No, not absolutely not.
And if you watch pilot, because pilots, we've had some positive things to say about pilot. We've also slagged it off a lot, critically, I think, like constructively, I think. But it's got a lot of it seems very restrained. It's it's very much focused on the medical mystery. The character development or learning kind of comes up from people just saying it out loud, and everything's it doesn't really have a lot of bite to it. No. and then on top of that, you have like lots of nice scenes with the school children at the end running in to hug the teacher who's all better. It's the show definitely takes a big turn, but that's what's so interesting about watching the first season as a whole. Like, you watch the pilot and you watch the last episode, and you can really see, just in terms of its tone and energy and like all of the weight of the character from the first episode, like how much that shifts over the course of the season.
Yeah, I agree. But I guess building on that kind of carving out a space for the character, that doesn't mean that the episodes in and of themselves are lesser than the other episodes after episode 11, and it doesn't mean that all the episodes after episode 11 are monumental to the character building, because I mean, you could easily say sports medicine could have been chopped. Control probably could have been chopped, maybe. I don't know.
I think you would have chopped the whole Vogler arc, because in case, because obviously if somebody's skipping around, they might not know the background to Vogler being introduced, which was that it was a push by the producers. It was actually the head of Universal who said he wanted a big bad antagonist, and it's kind of like watching the show in full. You can kind of see that kind of the more interesting thing is that the antagonist is not only the medical mystery, the disease is the antagonist every week, but that also that House himself is kind of the antagonist. Like, he gets in his way. He's a very self-destructive character, and the way he handles situations is the antagonist. But, this is what we mean when they say, like, it kind of feels like a very different show snuck under the producers, because there was a lot of disagreement. The fact they wanted a big bag boss, and then it was gotten rid of after 5 episodes because it wasn't working, says a lot. Like, I get the suspicion that most people who like House like Vogler, and they like the arc. People don't really seem to notice it, but having watched it again, it is very weird.
But you said yourself that you kind of were not necessarily opposed to it, that it did do some interesting things.
Having watched it again and having heard a lot more of your thoughts about it and why you don't like it, I totally get why season 1 probably would have been better without it. But I think Vogler kind of adds some stuff. I guess what I like about Vogler is he does put more pressure on House, which leads to some kind of mid-season cliffhangers, which I think are good in shows like that. But I think the problem is, at the end of the day, that Vogler is possibly a bit too overpowered, and he probably could have easily destroyed House, and the show kind of keeps reeling back on that. And then he leaves really quickly, like within 5 episodes. So it's sort of just a weird mid-season blip, but it's I don't mind it at all. I think Vogler's pretty different in the way he approaches situations. He's a pretty good, like, he's very different to Cuddy. He's more extreme. He's more extortionate than Cuddy. But I think Cuddy's
Yeah.
better because she's more subtle. She's like more charismatic, and and Vogler's just like the really kind of lazier version of Cuddy, and that's fine. But it's probably not as strong as it could be. But I don't think Vogler's particularly awful. I think he brings out some really good stuff in some of the episodes he's in. He's in some of my favorite episodes of the season. So that's all I can say, really. Not that there actually is a bad episode in season one. I think that's what's so impressive about season one is that there's not an episode that I wouldn't watch again, which is pretty stunning. But sorry, off that vague statement. Yeah, but I know that you don't like Vogler really at all.
I have great puzzle. I'm always puzzled of why this character is introduced. Puzzled not by the backstory for why that happened, but really by the character themselves. It's kind of like quickly put together villain who's kind of like, I can crush you, house, but I'll row back just this one time. I'm gonna crush your house, but I'll row back this one more time. I'm gonna crush your house, and I'm gonna crush you good. Oh, wait a minute. Whoa, I need you to do something for me. I'm gonna crush you. I'm gonna get you. Oh, and then it's like he gets squashed by the board. Okay, great. Thanks. That's all it took in the first place. Why did they go to that length of just not doing anything about it? But there was tactics, and obviously there's like an internal logic that makes sense. But I don't know. I just think it was a waste of money.
Yeah, that's fair.
Oh, they could have written someone, a villain much more compelling, and have Chi McBride play it. But to me, it was just a waste if you're going to create, and also to just randomly throw them in and then I guess their intention was maybe that villain would stay on, but as you say, like the escalation was unsustainable. Like there was always going to have to be like a confrontation, like a big massive confrontation that would have to end in something. So come on, like, dude, what is going on? So yeah, I do have massive antipathy, voluminous antipathy to this character.
Yeah, I think it also screws. Having watched it again, it screws very much with the atmosphere of the show. The thing about House is because it just feels like people coming into work, and it's not like a show like Grey's Anatomy where it feels like there's just lots of drama going on with everyone, and everyone's having problems at work. Like the show is people come into work, they kind of have a pretty intense work day, but then they go home, and it kind of does feel like real people at work, which I think the show really nails that atmosphere. They feel like very real people. And so I think what Vogler does is Vogler makes like the consequences a bit intense. It's like it's not just they come into work, they have a really interesting, time learning and working with House. Like, yeah, it just seems like everyone has a very interesting and intense job that they enjoy, and you can see why they enjoy it. And then when Vogler turns up, it's like everything gets a bit real. Because until then, like the consequence of each episode was just, oh, maybe the patient will die. And then it starts becoming, oh, maybe House will lose his job. And it's like, I don't know. That's not as worrying. Like House is pretty, famous. I'm sure he'll get work elsewhere. If you see what I mean. It's like somebody dying is more engaging than people might be made unemployed. I think.
Yeah.
It's a very big tonal shift, and then it kind of feels a lot more like it could happen in any other random TV show. And then when he disappears, you get back to that, and then it's like, oh, House is going to do a lecture. Oh, we're learning about, House's troubles. Oh, House's girlfriend has appeared. And then it's like the big problem of that is, will House confess his feelings? Like, those are the kind of more grounded consequences that I like. Rather than, the hospital will lose 100 million, or there's a bomb in the basement. It's like, oh no, House might not be happy, which I think is a lot more realistic and very human and grounded. It's kind of like drama on a microscopic level, which I much prefer when the show does. I don't like when it goes big.
And also the fact is, no one really, like you say, basically the consequence would have been House wouldn't be employed by Princeton Plainsborough Hospital. How big a deal is that for House? No one has really spelt that out.
Yeah,
Like he hasn't gone, if I don't have this job, I'll go nuts or something or whatever. You know, there was no sense of urgency to his character. It was just like, you're gonna lose your job. He's a world famous specialist in diagnostic medicine. Okay, you're gonna lose your job. You just go somewhere else, like, because you can easily explain that it was due to a crazy chairman of the board who basically leveraged $100 million for my employment. Please, can you allow me to have a job somewhere else? I mean, why was Princeton Plainsborough so important?
Well, it is brought up that Cuddy is the only person who will give him a job, and that's why pretty much that's her leverage over him. So there is that element, but at the end of the day, it's like, even if House can't get a job in medicine, like, I mean, if House loses his apartment, I'm sure he can live with Wilson or his parents for a bit. It's like, you know, there's consequences, but
Maybe Gregory could live with his parents. Hey, come on.
I guess so. I mean, we don't know about his parents by that point. It's like, why not? Whatever.
Why not? Whatever.
I mean, I've lost my job before these things happen.
Yeah, so I didn't really understand Vogler. I just there are so many kind of weird, ambiguous ends to this plot. The stakes were not really well defined, and it was obviously because of the fact that the show would not run if Vogler or Vogler, as we call him.
It happens automatically. It's hard not to do.
It's you. You've broken me. You know, without that villainous character being in there, and actually, we end up with a quasi-villainous character, but the villainous character happens to be an ex-partner of House, and is actually not that villainous at the moment. And the threat is actually in the change, or the threat to the character is much more emotional and kind of more psychological. And that, to me, is a much more interesting villain than this kind of big, brooding CEO type figure who is like a kind of ham-fisted critique of the role of private healthcare in the United States. I mean, it just... Okay.
Yeah, because the whole season 1 arc of House, there's this very, like, the first 11 episodes, we're sort of introduced to him, and we're kind of given this idea, you know, we learn his methods, we learn the way he is, and there's this idea that there's more going on below the surface. Episode 11 really blows the door open, shows that he's got a drug addiction. You know, it's the first time that him and Wilson have an argument. He loses his temper, that, you know, his life is about working and he doesn't care about himself. And that's like, well, that's much more interesting. And then from there, there's kind of like it's this open secret that House is feeling that way now. And then, you know, it starts to, and then from then you just have this weird 5-episode arc where Vogler comes in and just threatens and shouts at everyone. And then he goes, and then we kind of get back to that, and then we get back to that sort of regular thing where we're exploring House's personal issues. And then in the end, we establish, you know, the problem he's had with his leg. And then, as you say, this kind of pseudo-antagonist who's his, you know, ex-girlfriend. And then we learn about him and her relationship. She's only in it for a few episodes, but we really get a good sense of her. And then that leads on to season 2. And it's a absolutely perfect arc where it raises the stakes towards the end, and it has this problem for House, but it's not really a problem because his ex-girlfriend is someone who's like very nice, very intelligent, very charming. You see why they get on, but the real drama is, you know, damn, are they gonna fall into their old relationship? And, you know, if they do, is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Lots of questions raised, lots of very human questions, which are very good. Like, who's going to be hurt from this? But, you know, that arc is really interesting and really good and really cements it as a great character drama. And then within 5 episodes, you also have, like, you know, the mega villain turns up. It's really weird. And I think it would make more sense if Vogler came towards the end of the series. But then you'd be robbed of all of that, you know, actual interesting drama. So the Vogler arc doesn't really slot in anywhere very well. I'd say it's definitely the biggest stumble of season 1.
It's a big stumble, and I think um, let's put it into another kind of little thought experiment. I'm loving these thought experiments at the moment. Imagine if what's more satisfying to an audience than you could have the Vogler arc, and you have it right at the end. Vogler's going to sack him. Oh no, plot twist. The board have ousted Vogler. Long live House. End. No changes, just end on that note.
Yeah.
Or is it more psychologically is it more interesting? It doesn't treat the audience like a complete load of schmucks by placing honeymoon at the end and seeing how that goes. And 3 stories and then honeymoon. That to me seems like an infinitely more satisfying ending to a season, because so many questions are raised, so many interesting points about the character are kind of raised and solved as well. So we are left with a completely interesting origin story for how House has become disabled and why he pops the pills. Or we can have, yay, he destroyed the bad CEO man.
Well, and
Hooray for House.
I think you can tell from the fact that 3 stories where we learn about House's background is very well known, very praised, and people could actually name that episode. Whereas, the episode where Vogler gets told to F off is nobody really knows that episode, and it's very middling. Like, I think the drama kind of speaks for itself, really, and how people respond to that. Like, people definitely respond more to, like, being invested in characters rather than big shock moments, which a lot of shows do. I think you could point to all of the shows that tried to copy Lost back in the day. Like, the reason they failed was not because they didn't have a cool enough concept, it's because they didn't have any characters to emote with, which is what Lost did. Yes. I think it says a lot. Like, characters can be very weirdly, they can be they're harder to write, firstly, but when they're gotten right, people really respond to it, and I'm glad that David Shaw and the team were really good, and I think that's why season 1 is so good for that reason. But on top of that, actually, we were talking about the characters a lot, which I guess shows, I mean, that is the focus of the show a lot of the time, but the real main, maybe not the focus, but the thing that takes the most time up is also the medical mysteries, which are pretty difficult to talk about because there's a new one each there's a new one each episode, so we couldn't really sum them up, but they are also insanely entertaining. And what's great is that not only they like little interesting mysteries, they always have a pretty like logical sum up. I think the show is very good at I've heard House MD is quite realistic medically, like it's one of the better shows for it. I know that it obviously has a lot of like sort of shorthand ways of getting through stuff. Like, people will do like a gene test in like an hour when actually they take like 2 months. But it's interesting to watch, and I think the show explains what's going on medically pretty well, where you can follow it. Like, I wouldn't say that, having watched House, that I know any more about anatomy or about how the body works or about medicine, but at the very least I can pretend I do, because I at least understood the kind of like series of events that led it there. And I think but like the way that that's handled, and then also the very best episodes, this happens many times in the first season, where the actual like medical drama, like the medical issues, then bring out a lot of dramas in the patients, because sometimes it's something they've done in their personal life has caused this problem, and then that causes dramas between the patients and their loved ones. And on top of that, also, sometimes it's the medical issues then cause problems in the team, because it fragments the team and it brings up issues that they're having. And it's all really well constructed. And it's not just about characters and drama, because actually the show is very slow drip feeding you information about the characters, but it's the fact that the plots are interesting, and they also create a lot of tension for the characters to then actually come out of their shells and discuss and confront each other. I remember in the first episode of this you did, is that like the characters aren't arguing about silly things. Like it's not like the characters are falling in love. It's not like Cameron and Foreman are like about to date and they're like arguing like, oh, I'm in a relationship with you, but we are at work. Isn't this awkward? Like the problems are like, I disagree fundamentally with the way you view the world. Like the arguments they have are a lot more, I wouldn't say highbrow, but they're a lot more like important than just like little relationship problems.
At least they're made to feel important.
Yes.
That they're striking at something that doctors would do, like ethics.
Yeah, completely.
What are we supposed to do here? We're going to kill the patient if we do it. We kill the patient if we don't. How? Resolve it. You know? So, yeah, and also worldviews, as you say. There's a lot more kind of... The characters clash on a much more abstracted level than just, you know...
Well, that was as you say.
Well, yeah, I know. I'm just agreeing with myself.
I can't take credit for it. No, absolutely. You don't want to. You don't want to pat yourself on the back. I'll pat it for you. Don't worry. Go on, carry on.
Oh, thank you. You're very kind. I. Oh, I think I'm gonna die now. So. Yeah. And I think that's the other part of it that I kind of enjoyed, was just that dialogues were a lot more professional. That there was an emphasis on these people not just as, living, breathing, emoting human beings, thinking human beings, but there was also this attempt to look at the professional element of it, that they weren't just, everyday problems transplanted into a different place, which is often what happens, where it's like, oh, let's just take the quotidian problems of the workplace and transplant them in the hospital and have people dying, so it seems more dramatic when those things happen, like falling in love, falling out of love, being angry, clashes of personality. It became more about, oh, we're doctors and our job is to treat people, and how do we do that best? And it's not always, it can be about personality. I think we see that tension with Foreman and House.
Yeah.
There's a personality clash, but also...
but it's always framed around their work.
Yeah, but there's also a professional clash.
Yeah.
We see that pretty keenly in I'm trying to remember, DNR. We see it in DNR. Sorry, I just needed to clarify which one it was. Yeah. Where there's a professional clash caused by an ethical problem that needs to be resolved. And yeah, that feels much more mature. It feels much more as though these people's jobs and professions and vocations matter, and aren't just these things to be kind of scrubbed away to create more kind of a more kind of personal drama formula.
Absolutely.
Or like I say, like a transplant of our lives onto their lives, because actually our working lives are going to be different from the fictional working lives anyway, because they're fictional. So things have to be much more kind of amped up to make the drama work. But anyway, it just seems to me that that was a good feature of this, and it was talking about ideas and ethics and practice. Those are things that are worthwhile, and I think that's what it was so striking about House in this season. And I hope that when we go on to the next season, we'll see more of it.
Yes. And it's quite funny, actually. Whenever we use examples of episodes, we clearly come back to certain ones. We come back to like DNR, Detox, Honeymoon, 3 Stories, a couple of the Vogler episodes. But what's quite interesting is that the episodes in between them, even though we don't reference them because they don't have like big moments, that they're all equally great. There's some, like, pretty much all of the episodes like never fall below a certain standard It's just that the ones that we're referencing just have very big character revealing moments, which I think is important to say because it might come across as like we only like 2 or 3 episodes.
Yeah, that's true. And the other thing is, that's just the way I've viewed the season. It's my own personal way of anchoring certain issues or illustrating certain issues, and yeah, that is something that's kind of unique to me. And I think of that episode as very striking. I think the same with Histories. I think that's pretty depressing stuff, where you see a clash on ethics of a homeless person who's gone in, and Foreman sees it one way and House sees it another. Foreman thinks that pushing the patient out is the best way to proceed. House doesn't agree, and that their professional feelings are also informed by their personal feelings too. And then Foreman goes on a journey to figure out, actually, that's not quite the best way to deal with it. Even though the patient dies, spoiler alert, he learns something from that things aren't so simple as he wants them to be.
Yeah.
And that doctors have a duty of care to those, even if the doctor has prejudice towards them, they have to overcome the prejudice. You'd think it would be the other way around, and House wouldn't take the case. But then we also learn, Wilson refers the case at first because he's the one that's convinced, but it's really arbitrated by Foreman and House. And again, that's another kind of episode that sticks with me, because Foreman has to go on this journey to be shown that his prejudice in that respect to homeless people doesn't always work out that way. And to me, that's what I like.
Yeah, and the fact that you learn, I think in a worse show you would learn that in a really overt way, whereas I don't think it's ever said. I don't think Foreman ever says to anyone like, "I just learned the value of homeless people today." Like, you can just tell through the reactions and the responses that he is growing as a character.
Oh, you'd have him at the end of the episode, like, on his knees, bawling like a baby, to really kind of hammer home the fact that he got it wrong. Yeah. And I think that's just grossly... It's pretty much disgusting to do that, because it really does infantilize the role of doctors in the medical profession, and also that I'm creating a straw man of sorts because I'm creating this fictional version of Foreman, bawling with his eyes out, written by less competent writers. But I think it touches on an essential truth, which is this season does not sugarcoat for the sake of making it easier for people to deal with the professional and ethical crises that come out of this season.
Yeah.
So, you know what? Yeah, my imaginary thing, he would just be, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I wish that I was a better doctor and I didn't feel this way about poor people." You know, it would have been like that. It would have just been absolutely pathetic. Because doctors make mistakes.
Yeah.
Doctors have prejudices. They're human beings. And to represent it that way, that's great. I have all the respect for them.
Well, that's kind of like a huge strength of the show, in that it even though it's new, and even though it's new, like, it's new to the medical procedural kind of scene, it basically breaks all the rules of all the previous, like many of the previous, I'm not slagging off every medical procedural or most like serialized dramas like this, but it pretty much breaks most of the rules on them. Like, not only for its tone and some of the themes that it goes into, but on top of like things like the way it handles, Foreman tackling his views on homelessness and how much he respects the patient. They've they're handled in a very subdued way, and then on top of that, then you have episodes like Love Hurts, where the big thing is that Cameron has basically bribed House to go on a date with her. And instead of it turning into a full season like Will They, Won't They, it's pretty much shut down immediately in that House is incredibly rude to her. And and they end the date really being like, oh my God, we have nothing in common. But it's extremely entertaining to watch, and it's very insightful to watch as they communicate around this really awkward situation. And even then, threads like that are carried on. We find out in Honeymoon, when House's girlfriend arrives, Cameron even has a bit of a realization about why House didn't like her, beyond that they have a personality clash. There's more depth, that he's more hurt than he lets on by this previous lover. So, it kind of, every time that it looks like it's approaching what could be a really generic scenario, it just kind of twists it or destroys it or drops it, but not in an unsatisfying way. It kind of just sort of breaks with tradition and handles it in what is probably a more realistic way.
So I think another thing to touch upon is one of the most interesting parts of the season is there are a number of central premises, and the one that I was always really interested in is the question of change, and the question of change within the season, the question of change before the season, and the question of change beyond the season. So in season 2, I guess, when that gets released later on. And at the beginning, you get this sense of this kind of fairly static character with a fairly kind of robust view on what the world is, with a few quirks here and there, as you said, kooky. And
yeah, I mean, not kooky later on, but it comes across as kooky, which I think is a strength of it, because kooky is immediately attention grabbing, but I don't think it ends at kooky.
It's the appearance of kookiness.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. I'm just using the word as a way, as like a placeholder for that kind of the appearance of kookiness.
Yeah, completely.
But what really gets to me is the fact that we go through that and then we start seeing that there's like a hinterland to the relationships that House has with the more kind of senior members of the hospital that he interacts with. That's Wilson and Cuddy, especially when we see Wilson celebrating Christmas with House alone. I mean, that's just very strange. And then as the season progresses, we're hearing about this House from before. He was good. He talks about how he's changed in a very charged way, especially when he's dealing with what is, as we know, drug addiction. And so those questions start creeping in, like what caused House to change? And so we get that in 3 stories. That question gets resolved then, but interweaved with that question of who was House before, why has he changed then? You get questions about, is House changing now? Because at the beginning of the season, he's very kind of rigid. He's quite narrow in his view on his interactions with people. And then all of a sudden things start just blossoming. We see relationships with Foreman and Chase change. So Foreman's relationship with House becomes much more combative, and then it becomes a little bit more kind of collegial at the end. We see Chase goes from this kind of golden boy persona to something a little bit more adversarial, to the point of being someone that cannot be trusted, per se. And then you have Cameron, where we go from this kind of churlish acknowledgement that she's pretty to going out on a date, and then also this weird relationship between House and Cameron over the fellowship and being part of his team. And that to me is Very interesting. And they get resolved in different ways. Some get moved on. So Cameron's gets shut down for now, but Foreman seems to be more converging on the fact that maybe Foreman wants to be more like House than he admits. And Chase is just in this kind of limbo of really kind of how does he reestablish trust with the person that he tried to shiv?
Yeah. Okay, Cameron's arc is very focused on confidence and her gaining confidence in herself and the way that she feels people are judging her, which, as you say, like, kind of feels very locked down because you can there are moments when she's dealing with it, but for now we don't really have like a conclusion to that of how she's doing. But we do start to see her come out of her shell a lot.
Yeah. I agree with that. I would say that what gets me, I was more referring to the fact that the relationships between House and the Fellows. But you are right. There is this arc.
Oh, I see. Sorry, you weren't talking about the characters. You were talking about their relationships
Yep.
with. Sorry.
Yeah, it's okay. But there's an arc going on there as well where she's trying to be more assertive in the way that her professional life is viewed. No, so that her professional life will improve, but also that she will get more confident so that she can be a better doctor. Because you have at the beginning, you have these kind of stall moments where she fails to tell someone that her child, someone is dying, and it goes to Wilson to do it, who's more well practiced. And actually, that could have been done. And if you ask that same character further on to do that, she probably wouldn't have any issue with it. So that's like an additional arc. With Chase, it's more there are these kind of little bits and pieces about the character. So,
Yeah.
Like we see some strained relationships with Faith, we see some strained relationships with Father, we see just very complicated relationships all round with those two things in particular, and we'll probably see those come to fruition. But they create these kind of, his personality is one where he wants to depend on himself and himself alone, because he's skeptical of family life because the family have let him down. He's skeptical of Faith because it let him down when he needed it most, and he walked away from it. So he's kind of like this weird kind of limbo character who's just trying to drive on it through himself, by himself. And that obviously is quite existentially interesting. And then Foreman is someone who I think is just trying to be a very accomplished doctor. He knows he has the skills. He knows he has the abilities. But he needs to make a decision about whether he wants to be more like House or does he want to be more like others. Like his whole place in the fellowship is really, I would guess, on a knife edge because he could easily leave and nearly did. But towards the end of the season, he makes a decision. He sticks with House.
Yeah.
Even though it means that there will be times where he will be challenged by House or he will challenge House where he thinks things are wrong. He thinks that's a risk worth taking on that risk. It's a risk worth taking in order to progress as a doctor, to become a good doctor, maybe even a great one. And I think those are the kind of like arcs that are operating, if I've described them with any degree of elegance.
No, you have, and you've also demonstrated how different everyone's arcs and personalities are, which is why the secondary characters are so nailed down, but they feed into the main character. Everything's very well connected, but not the same in every area.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it's not. Yeah, I think it would have been very easy for me to have said, yeah, the characters just do their thing, and that's it. And really, we should talk about House, and House is the only thing that's important. I mean, talking about that, we should also talk about Wilson and Cuddy. And really, I think Cuddy goes from kind of like it kind of oscillates between friend and the kind of ball busting precinct sergeant, as I've described it before. And Wilson earlier on didn't really have a role, but he's slowly assuming that kind of position of House's conscience, or at least someone who's willing to challenge House's positions on things.
Yeah.
Which
And who House is happy to talk about those things with. Because you can tell if Cameron or sometimes Cuddy come and question House and his personal life, he'll shut it down immediately, whereas Wilson gets some time, which is really, where Wilson comes out of his shell. Not just that Wilson is a conduit for House. I think Wilson's got a lot bubbling under the surface, and he starts to become a bit more... He starts to really add a lot more later on, but Wilson's big purpose is to have that kind of actual look into House as a person rather than just as a doctor.
Yeah. And I think that's interesting. It's really interesting to see that when House is talking to Stacey and House kind of refers to friends. She says, "Oh, your friend. Your only friend." It's Wilson, isn't it? Spoiler alert, you only have one friend. So obviously for House, Wilson's very valuable. He obviously likes him, as well as respects him. And it will be interesting to see how that progresses. I hope that it becomes more developed, because it felt to me as though it wasn't really developed that well.
Yeah.
In this, not as much as we'd like. There's no dynamic duo-ishness to it, if you get what I mean.
Well, that was going to be my next question for you to sort of round off the discussion. Was we've talked about all the really positive bits, but what do you think the season needs to do better, and what you hope it would do better in season 2?
Oh man, arguably it's gotten rid of the thing that it needed to in order to improve.
I can confirm Vogler does not appear in any of the later seasons, so fixed. Perfect show.
A perfect show. No. There were all these kind of sometimes some of the episode plottings could be very circuitous and difficult. But like you say, they're actually quite well written. I mean, sports medicine, maybe you could say, like sports medicine's a little bit kind of weird.
One note would be the word I'd use.
Yeah. And then also you've got Fidelity. Is it Fidelity? Yeah, it's Fidelity, which is just like the first, where are my electrolytes? Is still going to stay with me forevermore, because it's one of the most weird lines ever written. Where's my potassium?
Well, the rest of the season's good, but are you talking about like just odd, cringy moments in like the secondary characters and the patients?
Yeah.
Yeah, fair enough. Because some of the patients, most of the patients are great, but there are some patients, especially in the earlier episodes, which I agree fall a little bit flat. They don't quite take the time to spend on them. They're more invested. The writers are clearly more invested in like the medical mystery rather than the people that are being treated, which I think the show starts to fix.
Yeah. I think one of the things that it also needs to do is try and like the tone could be very strange, in the sense that sometimes some of the episodes were very kind of more realistic and some were a little bit more kind of like dancing on the head of that realism pin, and that created in the season, I think, a very inconsistent tone. For instance, you get a very kind of realistic picture in like Pilot or Paternity, but then you get these strange things that happen in Role Model, for instance. So in Role Model, there's that weird subjective-y thing that happens, and then like weird like hallucinations that occur. I mean, it just needs to stay in a lane with that, and I think that's really nitpicking.
Yeah.
I mean, you could argue that what I'm saying is absurd. because sometimes you need that tonal shift in order to represent the disease in a much more interesting way so that the story makes sense, rather than just like pointing at someone in a bed and saying they're hallucinating, for instance. I mean, so yeah, I mean, I'm going to come to my point. I mean, for instance, the hallucination seen in sports medicine's a good example of something where it actually kind of works, where you see the hallucination from his side, and then you see House looking at him going, "Oh, I think you're hallucinating, mate."
You're right, mate.
Yeah. um, so maybe not. I just hope that it continues to develop those roles rather than just, and that it doesn't just introduce arbitrary characters without really creating a consistency there. Because with Vogler, the problem with that whole thing wasn't really that they put Vogler in. It's the fact that they kind of made him this all-powerful god in like the first 15 minutes, and all of a sudden he's now the all kind of impotent and kind of weak CEO in others. And what needs to be done is there needs to be at least a building of menace or consistent level of menace or existential threat to the character to make it work. If you're going to have that in the show, then
stronger
please.
patience and less Vogler.
Yeah, less Vogler, but if you're going to have a Vogler, make it a better Vogler.
Yeah. Make Vogler great again. Yeah, you actually already brought up mine. Okay. Which when you were running through the team, the fact that you discussed Chase's arc in about a sentence, but you spent about 4 minutes talking about Foreman. Yes, and then you sort of touched on Wilson, and briefly discussed Cuddy. I think like that would I think the patient observation is a really good one, and I hadn't really thought about it because the patients do get a lot better as the season goes on. So it's something that I'd sort of forgotten about. But yeah, like arbitrary one show characters need to be much tighter at points. But yeah, my like, but I kind of get that that's understandable. But my big problem would be the main characters. At points, it feels like it's very unfairly weighted in who's getting time. Which, even though I think like characters like Chase, like you learn a lot about them and they're very interesting. They're extremely well portrayed. Like extremely well acted by the actors. Sometimes they take a bit of a backseat, and I think that I kind of get Cuddy because Cuddy's initially there as a sort of more side character and she gets more involved. But I think Wilson and Chase specifically need kind of a bit more going on sometimes, and I don't mean that they have too little going on in the season as a whole. I just think that compared to other characters, they have less going on. Like Cameron. Gets a lot of focus, and that's great. We learn a lot about Cameron. Foreman gets a crazy amount of focus, but Foreman has a really interesting arc because it's that whole does he want to be like House? Does he want to be a different doctor? Does he want to be a better doctor? What does he want to be? What does he want to get from being a doctor? And we know a lot about Foreman. Foreman's a really interesting character, and like that's not to say that Chase and Wilson aren't less interesting, but we do learn significantly less about them, and they do get a lot less screen time. And sometimes it can feel like, we meet Chase's dad, who he has a bad relationship with. And at the end, we sort of get a bit of sort of kind of nihilist, like kind of pessimistic resolution in that Chase kind of starts to forgive his father, but we know he'll be dead. But then it's not really touched on again. And I know it is later, but I feel like Foreman kind of gets the beginning and end of an arc. And obviously there's future growth there, but we really learn a lot about Foreman, whereas Chase kind of gets hints. Wilson kind of get hints. We know that Wilson's getting divorced. We know he's friends with House. We know they have a bit of a weird relationship. But it doesn't feel like you really get to the meat of it. And with Cameron and Foreman, I feel like you get to the meat of them. So in season 2, I would like to see a lot more from Chase and have kind of more insight into him, which I think definitely happens. But it's something I noticed in the season that, we made that joke about the Foreman trilogy. We were like, when there were 3 episodes that were all about Foreman, And then even at the end of it, we were like, oh, thank God the trilogy's over. And then the next episode was literally about Foreman again. It's like, oh my God. It's like Foreman was actually not a film. He was a TV show, and he just took a season break. It's like he's back. So that would be mine. It's not that anyone's underdeveloped. I just think that some characters are having a lot more focus put on them. And but character writing really seems to be some of the improvements, but extremely nitpicky because the character writing is still really high quality most of the time. Except for electrolytes.
No, you're right. There needs to be a more consistent kind of outlining of the characters. It seems like people have. There might be some sort of kind of favouring of certain characters over others by writers. I don't know. I mean, I'm reading into their intentions, but I'd say that there's definitely an inconsistency there. The characters don't all seem fully fleshed out, and I don't know if that's like in prospect for the next season, or whether that was just a general weakness. But it still comes, as viewers, it makes us think that it's inconsistent, and therefore that is what matters, I guess.
Yeah, I totally get that.
So if we were in like 2005, we wouldn't know there's another season of House coming. So, the characters as we experienced them was basically what we were getting.
Yeah.
And in a way, I think you're right. It was under development there. But on the other hand, there are only 22 episodes. Yeah,
and they're still fitting in big medical mystery plots within this, so very impressive.
Yeah.
Which I think is really how I'd sum it up. Very impressive. Like, first season of a show, holy damn. One that isn't like based around a big mystery. It's not like Westworld or something. It doesn't have a big mystery behind it. The mystery is, how has House changed? And who are these people? And they give us some great, interesting little plots, and they answer those, in a very engaging way. Like, wow, what a fantastic way to kick off a show.
And just a side point, because I just cannot help myself from stopping you wrapping up this show. There's also one of the strengths is that the pilot seems to be that all the thoughts are exteriorized by the characters. After that, one of the key strengths of this season is the fact that all of the feelings and thoughts get interiorized. They're like part of the interiority of the character.
Yes.
And House's silence, for instance, when he's confronted on very personal issues, is a very good example of that. And I just wanted to say that that's one of the strengths of the season. And it completely understands from the pilot that is not happening anymore.
Yeah, it's the silences and the change of subjects and the jokes and the kind of anger at things speaks louder than words. It's
Oh, absolutely.
Yes, I totally agree. It's of all the series achievements, it's that it basically fixed a lot of its issues after the pilot. But we've said enough about the pilot where we could probably host its own podcast.
Yeah, maybe we can do a minute by minute podcast.
Yeah, completely. Maybe we could.
Oh my God.
But there we go. I'll get back to wrapping it up. Because I think we've pretty much summed up our feelings on season 1 pretty well in general. We've talked about the successes, the weaknesses, what we'd like to see, and kind of general themes that have been very cleverly weaved into it. So, and even talked about its cultural relevance and even a bit about Hugh Laurie. So, yeah, well, it's been fantastic doing this. Thank you. Obviously with you, Gaz, because we're friends, so it's just fun to do this anyway.
Are we? Okay.
but it's
I'm
also
just a stranger off the street. You just got me on Fiverr. You pay me £5 a week to do this.
Yeah, I get the DD extras for free.
Yeah, that's like complimentary service.
Well, but as we said at the start, thank you very much for listening, and I'm sure when we do the next episode, this will pop up on your feed, but we're pretty much going to probably wait until the end of Christmas and then restart in January. But if you
Yeah.
check our Twitter or Facebook, so you can find us at HouseMDcast or Differential Diagnosis at HouseMDcast podcast on Facebook. We're there, and we'll sort of, if you don't see us in your podcast stream, then we'll be, then that's where more information will be. I think the last thing that we're probably going to do, which we thought just might be fun, is we're probably going to do a 24-hour stream where we watch every House MD season 1 episode in a row. Although we haven't picked a date for that, but we'll probably get that done before Christmas. So we're just thinking of a way to do it where we don't get a copyright infringement claim. So we will, we'll message about that at some point. But you can join us for that. You cannot. It might be awful. To not only spend that long doing it, but also us live without all the editing.
Season 1 is so nice. We want to review it twice.
Exactly. So really just a way to chat and hang out. So we'll let you know about that. But until then, we will thank you very much for listening, and we will most likely see you in the new year, which we'll crack on with season 2.
New year, new season. Or are we going to do the same season again? Is this it, the loop? We just kind of do season 1 over and over and over and over, like rerunning and refining and refreshing, or actually just a complete copy? I'd like to do that. It seems like an absurdist art project.
Well, I'll tell you what, tune in next year and you'll either be listening to season 2, episode 1, or just pilot again, where we slag off the pilot. But until then, we'll see you later.
See ya.